mystery and suspense narratives that we've examined in this course, female characters tend to appear in one of three roles: victim, femme fatale, or detective. Of course, there are enormous differences between these three roles, and I don't want to imply that this group of roles is necessarily restrictive, but it is incomplete. We'll see in this lecture that as the genre continues to develop, female characters appear in mystery and suspense fiction as three-dimensional, rounded characters that don't obey the logic of being either dead, seductive, or crime solvers. This development makes the genre's representation of female characters much more complex and nuanced, while also enabling the genre to reflect and comment on changes taking place in the societies around it. For example, strong women characters can influence mystery and suspense plots as protagonists without seducing male characters or solving crimes. This includes narratives in which women are the killers rather than the victims. Moreover, some examples of the genre focus on relationships among women characters. In these cases, male characters play a secondary rather than primary role. Mystery and suspense fiction narratives have always distinguished themselves by their sensitivity to their social context. The changing roles that women play is a great example of the ways in which the genre continues to evolve and flourish in the 21st century. In 2003, the feminist press of the City University of New York launched a series entitled Femme Fatales, Women Write Pulp, that was designed to bring American pulp fiction written by women between the 1930s and the 1960s back into print. Despite the title of the series, which implies that it was only designed to publish mystery and suspense fiction, in fact, it included titles from a wide variety of genres, including lesbian romances, science fiction, melodrama, as well as hard-boiled noir. I begin with this detail to emphasize the fact that the middle decades of the 20th century saw the publication of a wide variety of popular fiction written by women that contained many different types of female characters. Thanks to the feminist press, as well as the author and critic Sarah Wyman, who has edited an anthology of short stories entitled Troubled Daughters, Twisted Wives, Stories from the Trailblazers of Domestic Suspense, and a boxed set of novels with the collective title Women Crime Writers, 8 suspense novels of the 1940s and 50s for the Library of America, this work is much better known than it used to be. However, I want to focus on material from the middle of the 20th century for the first part of this lecture, not only because it's still understudied and underappreciated, but also because this era in some ways represents the high point of diversity in terms of women's roles in mystery and suspense fiction. A good example of a writer that the feminist press's Femme Fatales series succeeded in bringing readers' attention to is Dorothy Hughes. Hughes was born in Kansas City, Missouri, and over the course of her career, she published 14 crime novels and 1 nonfiction crime book. Although her work was highly regarded during her lifetime, she received the Grand Master Award from the Mystery Writers of America in 1978 for both her fiction and her mystery criticism. Today, much of her work is out of print. The critic, Nancy C. Joyner, has described much of Hughes's fiction as domestic thrillers in which the accomplished and upper-class protagonist becomes innocently involved in a situation of evil intrigue, finally resolved through the hero's cunning, character, and sheer luck. What is domestic about Hughes's work? Partly the fact that she put a lot of effort into imagining new roles for women at a time when American society as a whole was being forced to consider the same subject. It's significant that much of Hughes's work appeared in the 1940s, at a time when gender roles in America were being redefined rapidly. Since so many American men were abroad fighting in World War II, the war years saw unprecedented numbers of women entering the paid labor force for the first time. When the war ended and the men returned home, it seemed that women were expected to return quietly to the kitchen, and many women were not happy about that situation. Two of Hughes's novels in particular explore the way the war disrupted what were previously considered to be unshakable gender relations. In The Blackbirder, which was published in 1943, we learn about the dangerous situation in which Julie Guile, a 22-year-old refugee from occupied France, finds herself in after entering the US illegally via Cuba. After a friend of hers from Paris is murdered in New York City, Julie is convinced she'll be next, and so she escapes to New Mexico in search of the Blackbirder, a human trafficker, who Julie hopes will be able to get her out of the country. Julie is eventually saved not by depending on the Blackbirder, but by her own bravery, intelligence, and belief in herself. What distinguishes Julie from so many other female characters in mystery and suspense fiction is not only the fact that she's the protagonist, but also her determination not to become a victim, the status reserved for so many other women in the genre before her. Hughes's 1947 novel In a Lonely Place shares with The Blackbirder a fictional universe influenced by war, but is even sharper and more explicit in its criticism of the usual roles for women in mystery and suspense fiction. The novel is set in post-World War II Los Angeles and features protagonist Dix Steele, a veteran fighter pilot and a serial killer of young women. The fact that Steele also aspires to write a crime novel is Hughes's sly commentary on the centrality of violence against women to the genre. Although Brub Nikolai, the police officer in charge of the murder investigation, is both conscientious and committed, his friendship with Steele, and in particular their bonding over memories of their wartime camaraderie, renders Brub unable to see that the murderer is standing literally right in front of him. By contrast, the two main female characters in the novel have no illusions about Steele. Sylvia, Brub's wife, realizes that there's something wrong with Steele from the first time she meets him. Laurel, Steele's girlfriend, takes a little longer to come round to Sylvia's point of view, but eventually, by working together, it is these two women, rather than Brub, who set a trap for Steele that leads to his capture by the police. While not detectives in the professional sense of the term, Sylvia and Laurel prove to have the intelligence and courage to capture a serial killer, and in doing so, they extend the roles that women play in the genre. If Hughes's work often explores the ability of female characters to both resist and defeat a violence that is frequently coded as male, then other female writers of mystery and suspense fiction during this period take a different tack by exploring either the potential or the reality of women to commit acts of violence in their own right. In an absolutely extraordinary 1957 novel entitled Bunny Lake is Missing, written by pulp author Miriam Modell using the pen name Evelyn Piper, the novel's protagonist, Blanche Lake, finds herself in a situation where she's willing to do almost anything, including murder, to achieve her goal. Imagine this scenario. You're a young mother who has just moved to a new city and started a new job, and at the end of the day, you go to collect your young daughter from her first day at daycare. The problem is, your daughter's gone missing. What's worse, No one at the school even remembers seeing her. And even though the police investigate the disappearance, it's clear that they think you're insane and that you don't even have a daughter. This is the nightmarish situation into which Piper plunges Blanche Lake, who is in a race against time to not only find her daughter, but also to prove her very existence to those who think she's hallucinating. Piper does a brilliant job of suffusing her fictional scenario with a steadily and relentlessly increasing amount of dread. But the real triumph of the novel is its characterization of Blanche Lake. Although she begins the novel as an insecure and vulnerable young woman, as events unfold, Blanche not only turns out to have reserves of strength and determination that neither she nor the reader could have dreamed of, but she also discovers a potential for violence that she's willing and able to use in order to get her daughter back. For example, having armed herself, at one point Blanche utters the immortal line, "In gun we trust." In this simple sentence, Piper captures both the centrality of violence to American identity and the potential of a violent woman to extend and even upend the conventions of mystery and suspense fiction. Like Hughes and Piper, Vera Caspary is another writer who once enjoyed considerable commercial and critical success, but whose work has since become somewhat neglected. The exception to this rule, of course, is her 1942 novel, Laura, which actually began as a play before Caspary adapted it into a novel. After a long and complicated process, which involved making changes Caspary didn't agree with, the classic film noir adaptation of Laura, directed by Otto Preminger and with Gene Tierney in the title role, seemingly cemented the novel's reputation. Unfortunately, Caspary had good reason to be unhappy with the film adaptation, no matter how successful it was, because it makes Laura look more like a garden variety femme fatale than she is in Caspary's novel. In fact, the novel works as a subtle commentary on the woman as an object of desire in mystery and suspense narratives, a figure upon which various male characters project their needs and fantasies. Although some of this emphasis survives in the film version, it's much more pronounced in Caspary's novel, which indicates not only her familiarity with genre conventions, but also her desire to subvert them. The same is true, if not more so, of Caspary's 1945 novel Bedelia, which also features a strong and charismatic female protagonist. While Laura had a contemporary setting, Caspary chose to set Bedelia in 1913. Why? Because this gave her an effective way of stressing the limitations placed on women who yearned to be independent in a period that was even more restrictive than the 1940s. The novel tells the story of Charlie Horst and his wife Bedelia, who on the surface appear to be blissfully happy newlyweds. As the novel progresses, however, Charlie realizes just how little he knows about his wife's past. He gradually becomes convinced that Bedelia is not only a criminal, but also a serial killer of her previous husbands by means of poison, and that he may be the next victim. What's striking about Caspary's treatment of this subject is not so much that Charlie's suspicions turn out to be correct, but that Caspary spends very little time exploring Bedelia's motives for her homicidal actions. When she's trying to persuade Charlie not to turn her over to the authorities, Bedelia attempts to explain or exonerate herself by saying, "I'm your wife, you know, and I'm sick. I'm a very sick woman, your wife. I've never told you, dear, how sick I am." Although Bedelia is referring to her physical health, given what we know about her at this stage of the novel, this seems as much a psychological as a physical diagnosis. Bedelia's fate is also instructive. She dies, technically by her own hand, but in reality because, like a dutiful wife, she obeyed her husband's instructions to take her own poison. In this way, Caspary suggests that there's no room for a character like Bedelia to live, either in America in 1913 or in mystery and suspense fiction in the 1940s. If Bedelia's violence is directed outward, other female-centered mystery and suspense narratives suggest that a woman's violence can also be a product of a violent struggle within femininity itself. The work of Margaret Miller is particularly instructive in this regard. She's yet another example of a female mystery and suspense writer who was once very highly regarded. She received the Mystery Writers of America's Grand Master Award in 1983, but whose work is now unfairly neglected. Miller was born Margaret Sturm in Kitchener, Ontario in 1915, and married her high school sweetheart, Kenneth Miller, who would later go on to great fame as a mystery writer, publishing under the name of Ross MacDonald. In fact, MacDonald chose to use a pseudonym so that his work wouldn't be confused with that of his wife, who was already an established author when MacDonald began his career. According to MacDonald, he was inspired by his wife's work to become a writer. By going on ahead and breaking trail, she helped to make it possible for me to become a novelist. Miller began her career in the early 1940s by publishing 3 novels, beginning with The Invisible Worm in 1941, which featured Paul Pry, a psychiatrist detective. Apart from writing a number of standalone mystery novels, Miller's oeuvre also includes 2 other series, one police procedurals featuring Inspector Sands, and the other legal thrillers whose protagonist is a Latino lawyer by the name of Tom Aragon. As this brief summary suggests, Miller's work was very diverse, but many of her novels use variations of what has been characterized by critic Jake Hinson as a woman in distress plot. Miller puts her female protagonist in a difficult situation at the start of the novel and then keeps raising the pressure relentlessly until the explosive twist ending. This is a perfect description of one of Miller's best novels, Beast in View, which was published in 1955 and won an Edgar from the Mystery Writers of America for Best Mystery Novel. It tells the story of Helen Clairvaux, a reclusive heiress who receives an unwelcome phone call from an old friend by the name of Evelyn Merrick. The phone calls become more frequent and threatening, and so Clairvaux asks her family lawyer, Paul Blackshear, for help. The strength of the book lies not only in its characterization, but also in the fact that Miller devotes equal time to both Helen and Evelyn, who in a sense become the shared protagonist of the book. Just how true this is becomes clear in the twist ending of the novel, when we learn that although Evelyn Merrick does indeed exist, she's entirely innocent of stalking Helen. Instead, it transpires that the Evelyn we've grown to fear over the course of the novel is Helen's alter ego, the more sexually aggressive and independent part of herself that she's split off and externalized into another personality. Even more shocking and unexpected is the fact that it's Evelyn who eventually wins the struggle between her and Helen, as we learn from the closing words of the novel, which are told from Evelyn's point of view. She pressed the knife into the soft hollow of her throat. She felt no pain, only a little surprise at how pretty the blood looked, like bright and endless ribbons that would never again be tied. When Evelyn/Helen kills herself, she becomes both murderer and victim simultaneously. In Beast in View, Miller writes a novel that possesses both great psychological complexity and keen insight into the struggles between desire and respectability that women can internalize. Struggles that in this case turn out to be literally fatal. At first glance, it might seem eccentric to now add Patricia Highsmith to a lecture about female-centered mystery and suspense narratives. Why would this be eccentric? Partly because the vast majority of Highsmith's work, and in particular her novels, as opposed to her short fiction, features male rather than female protagonists. Moreover, as critic Diana Cooper Clarke once pointed out to Highsmith, most of her female characters are portrayed rather negatively. I find that in a number of your novels, the women seem despicable in trivial ways. They are often cheats: Melinda in Deep Water, Hazel in The Glass Cell, Alicia in Suspension of Mercy, Miriam in Strangers on a Train. Highsmith responds to this observation by saying that the whole picture looks as if I suspect that women have narrow characters, which is not really true. It's not my personal feeling at all. In fact, she adds, I have quite an esteem for women's strength. Was Highsmith telling the truth? Well, consider the fact that in some cases she seems to have encouraged the view of herself as being hostile to women, as when she published the deliberately provocative short fiction collection entitled Little Tales of Misogyny, which includes stories like The Coquette, The Fully Licensed Whore or the Wife, that's all one title, The Breeder, The Mobile Bed Object, and The Perfect Little Lady. Given these titles, even though they may be tongue-in-cheek, Highsmith's response in the interview seems quite disingenuous. But then, consider her 1977 novel Edith's Diary, which stands out in the context of Highsmith's oeuvre as a whole by virtue of having a complex, sympathetic, and three-dimensional female protagonist. The novel tells the story of Edith Howland, a freelance writer and housewife, who tries to organize and analyze her life by keeping a diary. But as Edith's life collapses around her, with her husband leaving her for a younger woman, her being left to care for her ex-husband's invalid uncle, and her son Cliffy turning out to be a complete waste of space, her diary starts to play a different role. Specifically, in her diary entries, Edith starts to create an alternative reality in which she is happy and successful, and her son is an accomplished and prosperous engineer with a beautiful wife and 2 adorable children. There's no crime in Edith's diary, unless you count Cliffy administering a fatal overdose of codeine to the bedridden uncle, which he may or may not have done deliberately. Nevertheless, it's a tremendously suspenseful, even heartbreaking novel, as we're forced to witness the gradual but inexorable process through which Edith comes to inhabit fantasy rather than reality. When Edith accidentally slips on the stairs and falls to her death at the end of the novel, the last thing she experiences is a great sense of personal injustice. This indicates the extent to which Edith's diary can be thought of as a crime novel. But what exactly the crime is and who the criminal might be remain unclear. Thankfully, Highsmith clarifies neither of these points, which leaves us free to admire how creatively she repurposes the suspense novel to achieve her particular ends. The writers I've discussed so far in this lecture make it clear what a rich legacy these women left for subsequent writers in the genre who wish to rethink and extend the representation of female characters in mystery and suspense fiction. What did later writers do with this legacy? I'd like to close out this lecture by answering this question through a discussion of the work of one of the most popular female writers working in the genre today, Gillian Flynn. In just 3 novels, Sharp Objects, published in 2006, Dark Places, published in 2009, and Gone Girl, published in 2012, Flynn has reshaped the landscape of contemporary mystery and suspense fiction. How has she done it? There are various answers to that question, of course, but I believe a key part of her success has been her ability to build upon the achievements of her predecessors by offering a range of ways in which women can appear in the genre by placing women at the center of her narratives. Her debut novel, Sharp Objects, tells the story of Camille Preaker, a reporter who returns to Wind Gap, Missouri, the small town where she was raised, in order to investigate a series of child murders. Ensuing events illustrate the fact that her return is as much an exploration of and coming to terms with her own past as it is an investigation of the murders, and indeed the two things turn out to be connected. I can't say any more than that because I don't want to give away the ending. Dark Places is set in Kansas and features protagonist Libby Day, who as a 7-year-old witnessed the murder of her mother and 2 sisters. Libby testified against her brother Ben, who was convicted of the crimes. Now, a penniless and directionless adult, Libby comes across the Kill Club, a group of enthusiasts who revisit and discuss notorious murder cases. Libby sells family memorabilia to the members of the club as a way of making some money. But as she gets to know them, she finds out that most of them believe her brother to be innocent. This forces Libby to revisit the past and the events of that night, with shattering consequences for both her and others. Although her first 2 novels both sold well, Gone Girl took Flynn's career to a different level. Nick and Amy Dunn appear on the surface to be the perfect married couple, a kind of reflection of the idyllic suburb they live in. But the truth is very different. When Amy finds out that Nick's cheating on her, she fakes her own death in order to frame Nick for the murder. Using a combination of Amy's diary entries and an account of Nick's actions, Flynn shows just how toxic and violent a decaying marriage can be. What do these 3 novels have in common? A clue comes in the form of an interview Flynn gave after the publication of Gone Girl, in which she says of herself, "I am on the surface an incredibly even-keeled, laid-back Midwestern type, but in my mind I occasionally indulge in wonderful dreamscapes of revenge and become quite a drama queen. And the fact is, I don't say the things that I would in my grand Betty Davis on her 5th vodka sort of speeches, but I certainly identify with that moment of pure rage." I'm not suggesting that Flynn's novels are psychobiographies. Rather, what I'm arguing is that each of her novels explores women's capacity for rage and the varying consequences of the rage. Sometimes those consequences are played out on the body of Flynn's protagonist, as with Camille in Sharp Objects, who self-harms to such an extent that her body is covered with scars, making her visibly as well as emotionally damaged. And sometimes those consequences are directed outward, as with Amy's elaborate revenge plot against her cheating husband. In every one of Flynn's novels, however, women, in all of their contradictory complexity, are at the center of the narrative. Like the other writers we've discussed in this lecture, Flynn refuses to let her female characters be limited to a single role. Instead, her work demonstrates the fact that when women are allowed to dominate mystery and suspense narratives, extraordinary things can happen.